On. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tiffany Montague, and I manage the relationship between Google and NASA. So on behalf of the NASA core team and the authors at Google team, I'd like to thank you for showing up today. We have the distinct honor of hosting Dr. Mike Griffin, the 11th NASA Administrator. Without further ado, Dr. Griffin.
Thanks. Well, I don't expect to compete with John Edwards, who I understand will be here later, but it is an honor and a pleasure to be here. I enjoyed my time out here in Silicon Valley, both running Magellan Systems down in San Jose and also my time with In-Q-Tel. So in a way, part of the way, this is coming back home for me, and I enjoy being here. I do have a slide presentation, as much as I hate those, because there are some things that pictures can show that are otherwise awkward. I'm not going to sit around and read slides to you, both because I find it boring, and I know you will too. And after all, if I can say this nowhere else, I can say it here. You can always Google it. So when I talked to Tiffany about what we might cover today, she sort of was divided, or thought maybe it would be a good idea to divide my time between what our present plans are for the government side of our space program, and then how that might interface with commercial interests and commercial developments. And I think particularly here in Silicon Valley, that's a good theme. So let me quickly run through for you what we're doing. And I want to try and do all of this in anything that I'm going to sit here and say. I'm going to try to do that in about 30 minutes and leave a good half hour for your questions that I hope will be more entertaining than my monologue. The key point that I want to make here, in case you haven't or in case you don't follow what we do at NASA, because frankly NASA is not as much in the public consciousness as it was in the 1960s. The key thing that I want to leave you with is that following the loss of Space Shuttle Columbia on February 1st of 2003, the nation and the nation's policymakers, President, Executive Branch, Congress, asked a lot of very deep questions. You know, why are we doing this human spaceflight stuff? It's clearly, you know, expensive, difficult, and dangerous. What should we be doing with it? And the failure board that was put together, that was run by Admiral Harold Gehman, Hal Gehman, did, I think, a great service to the country, because they went beyond the proximate cause of the shuttle's loss to the larger issues. And they also asked, why are we doing this? Because with the technology anyone can foresee for the next generation or two, spaceflight is expensive, difficult, and dangerous. And if you're going to do it, the goals ought to be worthy of the costs and the risks. And they went on to say that for a great nation like the United States, yes, we should do it. It is a strategic enterprise for the United States to push the frontier, to learn, to really learn to fly in space. But we're at its infancy, and it is difficult. And so the goals should be worthy of the enterprise. And sort of, oh, by the way, a program that consists of flying the space shuttle back and forth to the space station is not such a program. You need more. The President responded, the Congress responded, and they approved what many have called the vision for U.S. space exploration. I don't really like the term that much, to be honest with you. The way I refer to it as is they have changed the direction of the civil space program, and I think that's a good thing. And they've done it in law with the passage of our most recent Authorization Act in December of 2005. So it is now the law of the land that NASA is directed to take people back to the moon and prepare the way for a journey to Mars. And you should know that. There are a number of steps along the way. We're not just going to snap our fingers tomorrow and head for the moon. I mean, we can't. Although you would be amazed at the number of times I get questions from top-level policymakers concerning why don't we just haul some of that Apollo equipment out of the barn and head back. And of course the answer is there is no barn. We will spend the next 10 years recreating a lot of capability for spaceflight, hopefully going a little beyond, but we will spend the next 10 years recreating capabilities that this nation once had and threw away proactively and with malice aforethought during the Nixon administration. I regarded it as a mistake then. I see that there are a few of you who, like me, are old enough to remember the Nixon administration. I regarded it as a mistake then, and I regard it as a mistake now, and this President and this Congress have rectified that mistake, and now it's up to NASA and, frankly, to our industrial base in this country to set about fixing that. But there's a number of steps. We have substantial existing commitments to the International Space Station, to 15 international partners. This is a period of time when it is very difficult for the United States to keep his word, because finishing the space station with the space shuttle is going to be hard to do. But I think that the measure of a person or of a nation is the ability to keep its word when it's hard, not just when it's easy. So we will do that. We will extract from the building of Space Station many lessons. We are already doing so, and we will learn a lot about how humans react to the space environment that will help us on the way to Mars in the future. But once we finish the space station, the important thing about it is our next generation system for putting people into space, which will be online not later than 2014, will be capable of taking people not only into orbit, but to the moon. And that's our thrust now, to return to the moon no later than 2020, and then move on from there out into the solar system. Now, many people say, why so long? We did it in 8 years the first time. Well, we will do it in about 8 years the second time, too. It's just that we're not really starting until 2011 or so, after we finish the station. That is the existing commitment on the plate. That's a space shuttle rolling out on a crawler with a nice montage in the background. Since I took over, we've flown 4 space shuttle flights. I have refereed all of them. I'm happy to say they've all come out okay. There have been some interesting moments along the way. The space shuttle is an aging system. It will be 30 years old by the time we retire it, almost 30 years old by the time we retire it in 2010. And it doesn't fly easily. It has enormous capability, but it is temperamental. Our next flight is coming up, we hope, next week, and I'm hoping to add a 5th mission to that list. We're about 60% of the way through the building of the International Space Station. When done, it will be over 100 meters long in one dimension and actually close to 100 meters in both dimensions. Suffice it to say, it's like a good-size ranch house rambler in its overall capacity. It's a serious machine. It's a place for human beings to learn how to live and work for long periods of time in space, and there's an awful lot we need to know. We can't go to Mars until we can conduct safely the following thought experiment. Think about taking a submarine and sealing a crew inside of it and telling them to go on a 3-year voyage, and they have to take everything they need for 3 years with them, and they can't come back. Once you start, you can't come back. When you're ready to do that, then we're ready to go to Mars. Now, we've been sailing submarines for 100 years, and we can't do that. So we have some things to learn. Space station and on the surface of the moon are the places where we're going to learn how to go further out. So the moon is the first step. To me, one of the primary things about the moon is it is a stepping stone. It's a pathway to operational experience. And many people say to me, well, we've been there. Why do we need to do that? Well, the we who have been there are almost all people older than me. And by the time we go back, it will be 50 years since we've been. And I submit that we don't have a lot of current experience. So it's a stepping stone. We will also learn much of interest there on the moon. Apollo raised more questions than it answered. And there are a number of fundamental science issues that we can settle there. and a number of facilities we can build on the moon that are not easily buildable anywhere else. Building the world's largest radio telescopes by rolling out mylar foil with antennas embedded in them is one of the things we can do on the moon and just can't do anywhere else. And that will, I think, make fundamental advances in astronomy. The biggest particle accelerators we can build on Earth do not come within orders of magnitude of delivering the energies that the occasional cosmic ray delivers. So if we really want to probe the deep structure of matter at Planck scales of space and energy, then we must turn to very high energy cosmic rays, rare as they are. And the place to do that is above the Earth's atmosphere on the moon. Building the cosmic ray detectors is easy, getting them to the moon is hard, but it is orders of magnitude easier than trying to develop such capabilities with particle accelerators on Earth. So there will be things we can do that will be of interest, but for us engineers, it is also a stepping stone. This montage gives you sort of a picture of what our architecture is. If you've seen the pictures of the old Saturn V launches coming off of Pad 39 at Cape Canaveral, we went to the moon with one launch vehicle. This time we'll do it by rendezvousing two vehicles in Earth orbit, assembling a more robust capability, and then setting out for the moon. This lunar lander will be able to deliver 4 people for a week with several extra metric tons of cargo, even the first time out. It will be it will not be your father's Apollo, even though in some cases it looks like it, because the physics of the situation demand certain things of us engineers. This is the part where pictures are worth more than 1,000 words, and certainly worth more than 1,000 of my words, and this is the part where I'll let you Google it at your leisure. I don't know quite how I did that. Okay. These are shown to scale for comparison with the old Saturn V. Note that we have divided now the architecture into crew and cargo lifters. On the left is, well, of course on the far left is today's space shuttle for scale. Then the Ares 1, which his primary purpose is to put people or maybe 20 metric tons of cargo in orbit, possibly to the space station. On a lunar mission, it will rendezvous with the cargo stage from Ares 5, and then they will set forth for the moon. This is the expanded view. In the space business, we're always reluctant to use the term exploded view. If it looks like a lot like Apollo, again, that's the physics of atmospheric entry, which pretty much with our present level of technology or anything we can foresee demands a blunt body for the atmospheric entry on the return home. And if it's going to be a blunt body, I have several choices, but I have a very well-established aerodynamic database for Apollo. One of my beliefs is that a good engineer doesn't reinvent anything he or she doesn't have to reinvent. So we are reutilizing that shape, even though it holds 6 people instead of 3 and is about 5 meters in diameter as opposed to about 3.9 meters in diameter for the Apollo vehicle. We'll also be the first U.S. spacecraft to carry solar arrays, because we're setting this up to provide for 6-month rotations of crew on the lunar surface, much like people do in Antarctica today. And with that goal in mind, the crew vehicle has to loiter in lunar orbit for 6 months at a time, and you can't do that on batteries. The lunar lander will be something like this. Don't fall in love with the cartoon, but it's a workable cartoon. Note the piloted part of it is quite small. The crew is only in it for a few hours. We're trying to leave as much room as we can for cargo. And of course, you need a lot of fuel to go down and up. This is a conceptual view of what a pressurized rover might be with a crew on the surface. These are, again, some points that I'm going to let you read at your leisure. There are a number of things that I believe are interesting about establishing a lunar research station, a lunar outpost. very much, I regard our next activities on the moon as being very, very, very analogous to how the human race has developed Antarctica, or is developing Antarctica. People first went there, first successfully reached the South Pole in 1912. Quite a number of people were lost in the attempts to do so, and it was a very difficult thing to do. It was so difficult that once it was done, nobody did it again for more than 40 years. And when they went back, Norway was the first nation to reach the South Pole, but Norway wasn't the second. The United States and the then Soviet Union went back to the South Pole in the 50s, and after a few years, people started wintering over. A substantial multinational research base, or bases, exist in Antarctica, and there is even a South Pole station that the United States runs. South Pole is a very difficult place to get to, and much like the moon, there are times when if you're at the South Pole and something goes wrong, you just have to stay. I think everybody remembers the story of a few years ago about a woman surgeon who operated on herself for breast cancer over the middle of the South Polar winter because you can't get in and out. So, and yet we find scientific reasons galore, scientific reasons in abundance to have hundreds or even thousands of humans in Antarctica, and I think we will do the same at the moon in the coming decades. One of the most interesting places, well, two of the most interesting places on the moon are in fact the poles, because the moon has a very shallow axial tilt, unlike the 23.5-degree tilt that Earth axes have. The moon is nearly perpendicular to its orbit plane, and so has very little seasonal or diurnal change in in the insolation at the poles. So since we don't have any space-qualified nuclear reactors, that was another one of the things we ditched 30 and 35 years ago, we are dependent in the near term on solar power at the moon, and the moon has night periods which are 2 weeks long. So if you're at the poles, you can get nearly continuous sunlight in many regions, and that will be an advantage to an early research station. We've mapped the moon not as well as we need to and not as well as we will, but to some extent, and we've even identified a preliminary area that is particularly, we think, productive for an early base, because one of the things that's of interest about the moon is the possibility that there may be condensed volatiles in deep lunar craters. And there are regions that are relatively close to one another on the lunar South Pole that have permanently shadowed craters that never see sunlight and in which volatile elements may condense, right next to regions which get nearly permanent sunlight where we can extract power. So we're pretty interested in that. And don't be surprised if that's where we go the first few years. This is a notional way in which we might build up an outpost with pressurized modules brought down by lunar landers. Again, the similarity to Antarctica is, I think, striking when you look at the first Quonset huts that were put there in the 1950s. One of the first things we're going to learn how to do, and going to need to learn how to do, is to use the resources we find elsewhere in the solar system to help sustain life, because we can't keep bringing things up from Earth. It's extremely expensive. So we need, as the first settlers in America did, we need to learn how to live off the land. Now, well over half the Jamestown colony, the initial Jamestown colony, died because they didn't know how to grow or harvest existing food in Tidewater, Virginia, an area which kept tens of thousands of Indians alive and quite comfortable. But growing and harvesting food in the New World was not the same as growing and harvesting food in Europe, and they didn't know what they didn't know about how it was not the same. Now, England, in particular, in that era was overpopulated, and they just kept sending colonists until they figured it out. But we can't afford to do that, so we're going to have to try to learn a little bit more expeditiously and not kill off quite so many people as we proceed to learn how to use and utilize the moon. So it's a point of departure for future work. Now, our philosophy on this is very definitely not like that of the 60s. We are identifying crucial transportation elements that we think in this era can only be supplied by the government, and in particular only supplied by the U.S. government. The barriers to entry for interplanetary spaceflight are quite high. So that's an area where government investment should occur. But all of you here know, as I do, that if we can establish a market, if we can establish a program, if we can get over some of the barriers to entry, that it will be hugely more efficient to take care of those facilities, utilizing as much private and commercial development as we can to fulfill what is admittedly at first a government market. So we will be attempting to stimulate, augment, aid, and abet the development of not only international but also commercial ventures to help us with basic transportation and infrastructure needs. Here I've outlined in blue, I've outlined on this chart all the things we think we need, and I've outlined in blue that which we think the U.S. government budget for NASA will afford. So you can see that there are a lot of environmental niches for aspiring new companies and for international partners, and we expect to see both involved. We have an architecture, a plan. It's a point of departure, and I hope as the years go by you'll hear more about it. These are some of the reasons why we think it's important to do, but fundamentally for me it comes down to the fact that great nations are those that do great things. I think our nation, I think our civilization is a great one. We have ideals. We don't always live up to those ideals, but at least we have those ideals. And when the history of this era is written, the first voyages off of our planet to our nearest neighbor will live down through millennia in recorded history, and so will the civilization that makes it happen, and I want that to be ours. Now, I talked, that's my prepared talk. I wanted to talk a little bit about how we're going to factor commercial interests into all this. As best I can tell, if a given enterprise is right at the edge of what is possible to do, then a very good system has been worked out in Western society, and particularly in the United States, where we sort of share the risk of doing those state-of-the-art things communally, and we do it through government. That's how, frankly, much of the first air transportation industry was created. Certainly the ability to sail the high seas was backed by governments for hundreds of years until it finally became a truly practical commercial venture, and then only in the 20th century, after hundreds and thousands of years. The development of atomic power followed a shorter but similar course. It is now a commercial enterprise, but we all know that due to wartime exigency, government projects developed both the first atomic bombs and the first nuclear power reactors. But when something becomes possible to do, when the art of doing it is understood, and I studied this about as carefully as anyone I know, and certainly as carefully as I can, my assessment is that there's a factor of roughly 5, and I'll say from a range of 3 to a range of about 7 of efficiency difference between a commercial activity and a government activity. Meaning once you know how to do it, industry can, my assessment, do it something like a factor of 5 times better. And if you want to quibble with that, have at it. But to me, it's a number of that order. That means that it behooves us at NASA, because spaceflight is expensive, difficult, and dangerous, it behooves us to try to bring along, to stimulate, to augment commercial capability to the extent that we can. I've set aside $500 million over the term of my administration for purely commercial ventures led by SpaceX and rocket plane Kistler, to develop basic transportation to low Earth orbit on commercial terms, meaning buying a ticket from an airline as opposed to buying the airplane. And there's a fundamental difference there. The government runs aviation services. Okay, I have flown many flights on military air or FAA aircraft. Government air transportation is, surprise, not as efficient as flying on United or flying on American or flying on Delta. And so most of the time when the government sends me somewhere, I buy a commercial ticket. If the destination is difficult to reach or other exigencies apply, then I may take government transportation, but not usually. That's the philosophy that I want to see transferred to spaceflight. And so we are setting money aside as seed capital for the developers of such capability. Now that's a couple of steps at least below the capability to go to the moon and back, which is where I want to concentrate the government efforts. Also, once we have space station developed, we have at NASA for the very first time ever a known and stable market for logistics and resupply of both crew and cargo that will exist for years and that is measured in the several tens of metric tons per year of logistics requirements. That's a market that the government has never put out there before for industry to service. And so my baseline approach in our budget for the next 5 or so years is that if commercial industry can do it, they will be the suppliers of choice for space station logistics. By that means, I hope to attract, or I hope the companies who are doing this can attract appropriate private investment and then turn around and furnish service to us at, of course, they will want to do it for whatever price the market can bear. They will have to do it for less than my cost of doing it, or it would make no sense for me to spend taxpayer money buying it from them. But presumably doing it cheaper than the government can do it ought not to be that difficult. That's the plan. So in the NASA of tomorrow, look to see opportunities and places where we have put a market out there for commercial enterprise. In the near years, it will be servicing the space station market. In the out years, I hope it will be things like building and operating a fuel depot on Earth orbit so that we can launch more expensive, valuable cargo on the Ares 5 heavy lifter, but then we can refuel it in orbit and carry more to the moon or carry more to Mars. Things like that. How about power? Other things. Everything in space, certain military payloads and certain outer planetary payloads use nuclear power of one kind and another. But most everything in near-Earth space utilizes solar power. I wonder if it's possible for a commercial venture to put up a power station in low Earth orbit where others can dock and recharge fuel cells. I mean, is that a commercial venture? I don't know. It's an idea. Certainly it doesn't take the government to build solar arrays and build a power farm. And there are many other possibilities. So we're looking for that in the future using a sustained program of government-driven exploration beyond low Earth orbit to provide a market for state-of-the-art commercial ventures in this enterprise. And that's what I would like to see. My personal belief is that, well, let's just look back. In a century, less than a century, human beings, frankly most of them American human beings, took air transport from an experimental venture involving cloth and sticks to a transportation system that girdles the world and which is so safe that you have an equally high chance of dying by being struck by lightning as you do of dying in an air transportation disaster. Now that's a stunning statistic. I mean, that is an absolutely stunning statistic. But if you Google lightning deaths and Google air transportation deaths, you will find that over a 20-year period, they average out to about the same. Significantly, both sources of death are such low rate that you do have to extend it over a decadal time scale to get a statistically significant number. Okay, not, only about 3 in 10 million people die every year from being struck by lightning. And on average, when we lose an airliner, several hundred people die, but it doesn't happen every year. So in a century, human beings took air transportation from cloth and sticks to something which is safer than being out in an open field in a thunderstorm. That is a stunning achievement. And you probably don't hear things like that from, everybody else, but I run NASA. So I personally believe that capability came about because of the synergy between government demand and government funding and government research and development and experimentation and commercial utilization of such results and development into practical applications. I think commercial efforts without, especially the early government market for air traffic, air mail, military services, the commercial aviation would not have developed because it needed a market that was not going to be there by pulling itself up with its own bootstraps. But equally well, government can't demand something which doesn't exist and probably cannot develop it as rapidly and as efficiently as commercial enterprise can given a good market. So I think we owe the state of aviation in the world today to the private-public synergy that existed for a century in America in aviation. And I'd like to see that replicated in spaceflight in the next century. That's my goal. Someone said once that the difference between a goal and a dream is a schedule. And so I have our commercial providers on a schedule. So let's see if they can meet it. With that, I'll stop. That gives me something like 25 minutes for answering your questions, and just go to it.
Hi, I have 2 questions, and you can choose to answer these in whatever depth you like. The first is, historically, big space programs since Apollo have suffered from lackluster funding after the sort of big bang in the beginning.
Well, if you give people a lackluster program, you're going to have lackluster funding.
And so Shuttle and ISS kind of ended up like we didn't want them because of the politics and the funding that went into it. And I wonder, how do you ensure that this new initiative is not going to suffer a similar fate? And the second question is, how do you foster effective commercial competition and enterprise in the space industry, both in the United States and internationally, when currently the U.S. government treats space technology as a munition and has a lot of barriers to entry for a lot of companies and also competition?
Let me take the second one first, but I'll answer both. I would like to see our space companies competing internationally, not because I don't want them to win. I do, all right? I'm an American, and I believe in this country, faults and all, and I want our companies to be the best in the world. But they won't be the best in the world if they're running in a Special Olympics. Okay, they have to run the full field Olympics. And when we wall them off from competition because American aerospace products are regarded as munitions, I think we are purchasing short-term security, and we are. In the short term, we are purchasing security at the expense of long-term security because we are creating our own competitors and we are ensuring that they will be better than we are. So I think that this is a policy mistake, and I have said so in numerous venues, but NASA is not in charge. In this particular case, the Congress, as in all cases under our Constitution, the Congress is ultimately in charge. If people wish to see those policies changed, they have to write their congressman. With regard to the first question, look, again, under our Constitution, the budget starts over every year. No Congress under our Constitution can bind a subsequent Congress. No president can bind a subsequent president. This is an artifact of our system of government put in place by the framers of the Constitution explicitly to prevent tyranny and explicitly to ensure that unless most people wanted to do something, it wouldn't be done. So far, for 49 years, 48 years, people have elected to have a NASA. I predict that people will elect to continue to have a NASA. If you're going to have a NASA, meaning a government civil space program, you got to decide what you want it to do. I think the only purpose of government technology programs is to operate on and to push back the frontier in whatever area they work, whether it's National Institute of Health or Department of Energy with particle physics or NASA with spaceflight. Government enterprises exist and should exist to define, to push back, and to operate on the frontier. If that view continues to hold sway as it does right now, then we'll be in good shape. If it doesn't, then I fear for our country. Yes, sir.
Dr. Griffin, what are NASA's...
It's just Mike.
It's okay. What are NASA's view on space elevator development? Because
on what?
Space elevator development.
Space elevator development. I'm sorry. NASA doesn't have a view on space elevator development. I have a view on space elevator development. The space elevator is a really neat concept, which I predict one day we will learn how to build. We know at the very small level how to make materials with the required tensile strength. So it's basically an engineering challenge to be able to develop on a large scale materials that on a macro scale can take advantage of the strength of materials capabilities that are inherent in materials we can make in very small quantities. We don't know how to do that yet. When we know how to do it, the price of a ride to orbit will go down to the cost of the electricity, which in today's dollars is about, $15, $20 per pound. So I believe that such a thing will one day be built. But we are a long way. I mean, my guess would be decades, a number of decades, not centuries, but quite a number of decades is my best guess away from having not the materials science, but the materials engineering science of, how to build these things in chunks long enough to be useful.
But that's also a matter of investment, so you don't feel like committing more money than like a very small amount NASA commits now for development? Well,
there are so many steps between where we are and where we need to be, and NASA's current plate is so full. This is not a technology investment for NASA. Other people are going to have to want light, strong materials also. And this is an area where I think probably the commercial market sector is the place to push on that.
Thank you.
Yes.
I have two questions. You can choose to answer either one or both. The first one, you use the analogy of Antarctica for exploration of the moon and America's exploration.
I do. It's one of the useful analogs.
Right. And just like that, there's still controversy about the exploration of Antarctica. Some countries belong to a multinational agreement that helps them keep it from being dominated by any one country, but not all countries do. Now we have the United States going back to the moon. We have the Chinese who have announced that they want to go there, and the Indians as well. Are we pursuing something that would take care of that situation for the moon, like we are trying to do with Antarctica? Because some countries have laid claim to it. The second question is, the original Apollo program in 6 landings on the moon managed to get one trained geologist up there, Harrison Schmitt. Do we have plans to try and actually get scientists onto the moon as quickly as possible?
Well, scientists and engineers, because there's engineering development too. Yes, the early Apollo astronauts were for the most part pilots, and in fact, by the time Jack Schmitt landed, he was a pilot too, and a pretty good one. Jack's a personal friend of mine and heads my advisory council. So there's a difference between what you do in the earliest exploratory ventures and what you do in the steady state. Our lunar module that we're designing for the next go at it will carry 4 people, and obviously at least 2 of those can be scientists, and given the, the state-of-the-art in automation, it wouldn't surprise me if 3 of the 4 of them could be scientists and engineers. With regard to proprietorship or ownership of space assets, I can't really comment on that, not because of policy considerations, but just out of ignorance. The legal status of extraterrestrial assets is not really clear. It needs to be clarified, and for the same reasons as does the seabed and Antarctica. So I'm not going to go where I'm so ignorant.
To come back on the second question, do you have a detailed enough plan for the first lunar mission that would say whether...
No,
okay.
Not at this point. I mean, we're talking about something in 2019, so no. I don't have a detailed plan for the last space shuttle mission yet. Sorry.
Thank you.
Yes?
So you explained that the returning to the moon will take 8 years, but we're not going to start it right now, not till 2011 or something like that. Can you explain why it's going to take 8 years when we did it in 8 years with 60s technology, with no space station, and with no 4 extra years of thinking about it before really starting?
Well, sure. First of all, the space station is not involved with going to the moon. It's not in the same orbit that we would need to use to go to the moon. It's not helpful. It, at this point, represents a current commitment which we must finish before we have enough budget to go to the moon again, and that gets to the point of your question. During the Apollo era, we didn't have existing commitments, and secondly, we spent a ton of money in a short period of time, for about 5 years, to bring into being, in parallel, capabilities that we are redeveloping in series today. It isn't the technology level. When we return to the moon, it fundamentally will still be with 60s technology. Now, certainly not the electronics and the software, but the rocket engines and the metals and alloys and materials are not fundamentally different than what we've had before, because we have not much invested in aerospace technology in this country in the last several decades. So the technology doesn't much differ. We are recreating capabilities that we once had and do not have anymore, and we are doing them in series, not in parallel. So it will take more time.
So the basic answer is that there's some technological advancement which should make it easier, but mostly in software and stuff like that, and the smaller budget is a primary reason why that offsets.
Right, exactly. And let me be clear, smaller budget peaks. I not too long ago wrote a fairly carefully analyzed paper for Aviation Week in Space Technology. It's available online. And I pointed out that many people in the space business believe there is an Apollo myth, that we had like a lot more money during the Apollo years than we have today. And if you average over a decadal span or a 15-year span, and the entire early U.S. human spaceflight program was a 15-year program, starting with Mercury and going to the last Apollo flight. If you average over either a decade or a 15-year span, we get as much money today as they did then. But the ability to do systems in parallel depends on getting a high peak funding. So there was a very high Apollo peak for about 4 or 5 years, followed by a huge trough. Now today we don't have huge peaks and we haven't had huge troughs, and that's good. Not having troughs is good. But averaged over a decade in real dollars, we get the same amount of money today. And so averaged over a decade or 12 or 15 years, we can do what was done during Apollo. But we can't do it quickly. Okay?
I also have a second question, but I'm going to go to the back of the line.
Okay. Over here.
So with this model of the government sponsoring a bunch of markets which private companies can then invest in, do you see the uncertainties of future funding discouraging companies from investing a lot of their own money in a market which might not exist due to budget cuts?
I mean, sure. One of the things that I think the U.S. government space policy community, meaning those in the government who are interested and involved in or have professional responsibilities in space policy, one of the things I think we owe the industrial base, everybody from venture financiers to the people like you who are going to sign up to work for companies, one of the things we owe the industrial base is a stable plan, a stable program. It's not so much the amount of the money. We've got $16.5 billion in NASA this year. The ability to have companies invest depends less on the size, the total size of the market, than it does on knowing that what the market at whatever size is going to be there. That they need to know that the government is going to continue to allocate such and such an amount of money for human spaceflight, for the development of the frontier, the space frontier, and that we're going to stay approximately on the plan we're on. And if that kind of stability can be offered, and you as members of our industrial base in this nation should be clamoring of your nation's policy leadership to provide that kind of stability. You know, the space program has suffered since Apollo from a lack of a clear vision. Again, nowhere was that brought out more clearly than in the report of the Columbia Accident Investigation Board. And so ensuring that kind of policy stability is the key first step to getting people to invest. So you've raised the central question for government space policy.
Thank you.
Yes, on the right.
So aerospace is a fundamentally fascinating area because it's such a constrained problem set. Every flight vehicle, you know, you have to take into account a dozen factors because of manned presence. I
wish it were only a dozen. You have no idea.
So one of the questions I have, I'm going to go out on a limb, is to say there's just a ton of effort you can put into complex system development, like Earth to lunar kind of mission. But a lot of it is constrained because of energy and power systems.
Yeah.
So I would argue that if you took the amount of money and manned effort that you put into creating a specialized bus, if you will, to get us there, and a specialized bus to get us back up and out of the gravity well, you could do better building a nuclear reactor, for example, that you could glue onto a more standard bus or a submarine that you could get back and forth, and you could apply it to a lot more situations.
Look, I'm one of the primary advocates for nuclear space propulsion, and it will represent a step change in capability. But I advocate those things for the same reasons that you do, is that fundamentally I'm an engineer. And if you read my bio, that's probably pretty obvious. But in the real world, engineering is only one of the issues. It's not the issue. There needs to be a demand pull, not just a technology push. There won't be a program if I or someone at my level stands up and says, I'll tell you what, let's just put off doing anything until we can develop the best tools that we know, and then I promise you it's going to be really good in about 15 years. People will yawn. I may have to wake them up to provide the announcement that that will be our plan. And then they will go back to sleep.
So do you think the demand pull for the nuclear power could be met by commercial development?
I certainly think the reactor could be provided commercially. The demand pull will be a government demand for power on the lunar surface or more efficient transport of goods. Okay? Once it is established, as I say, that for a long period of time, that we have a stable program, that we are going to develop and sustain an outpost on the moon, and then we are going to go to Mars, then rewards will accrue to the company which invests in doing that more efficiently. But no one will invest if they don't understand that by the time they finish, a decadal development span, the market will still be there. Okay, so the demand pull is going to have to be supplied by the government, and it needs to be stable from a policymaker's perspective. I wish that we lived in a world that was governed by a rational exercise. Let me sit down and redevelop, and by the way, not develop, redevelop. I mean, the nation once owned a 900-second ISP nuclear rocket engine perfectly capable of taking us to Mars. We threw it away. So I wish we lived in a kind of rational world where we can say, let's redevelop that thing before we do anything else because it is so much more efficient. We don't live in that world.
Thanks.
Hi, yeah, I was wondering, you mentioned, well, the slides briefly showed, reusable rockets for getting payload up into orbit, et cetera. But are you actively pursuing other methods, say like, the whole space plane concept, scramjets, et cetera?
No, because we don't have the money to do those very neat and elegant and interesting and excited things other than we're doing some scramjet research with the Air Force. Those kinds of well, some of it is governed by money, and some of it is governed by shape, which has a lot to do with entry aerodynamics. Reusable rocket plane systems, while attractive, are fundamentally only useful for getting from Earth's surface to low Earth orbit and back. The shape does not lend itself, with any technology that we currently foresee, does not lend itself to atmospheric entry at lunar return speeds, never mind return from Mars. You really need, with the technologies we can foresee today, you really need more of a blunt body shape to come home from the moon. Now, if in a well-ordered world, I would develop separate systems to go from Earth orbit to the moon and back, as from Earth's surface to low Earth orbit. But I don't live in a well-ordered world. I live in a world where I will get to develop one vehicle if I'm lucky. So that one has to be capable of getting to and from the moon and later to and from Mars. And then, as with Apollo, okay, oh, by the way, if it can do that, it can certainly go to and from Earth orbit. Now, it's over-designed by a lot to go to and from Earth orbit, but if you only got one, I'm sure you see my point.
Right, great, thank you.
Yep.
This is actually a more personal question because I did read your bio. I noticed that you have 4 master's degrees after your original doctorate period.
I think it was 5, actually. But
the one I read said you're working on your 8th degree. So
I was, but I'm not anymore. I'm too busy.
Well, that's actually sort of the point of my question, actually two-parter. How did you do time management to be getting that many extra degrees while also working full-time and the like? And why did you feel you actually needed degrees in those subjects as opposed to picking it up as you went or just taking classes?
Those are good questions. I'll answer the second one first. I lack the internal self-discipline to just prioritize my time to take a random class that is not toward a goal or to just pick up a book and read it. Okay? Because there are always a lot of things to do. There's a business trip to be taken, or whatever that gets in the way. So I lack the self-discipline to set aside that time unless I establish a goal that is some overarching goal. I will sign up for and get this degree. Having then put myself on the line, I now will do what I have to do to achieve my goal, because I'm possibly the most goal-oriented person you will ever meet, even here in Silicon Valley. All right? So having established the goal, I will reach it, but I'll never start if I don't establish the goal. So that's why I did it in a more formal way. How did I find the time? I mean, it's a combination of factors. I don't want to, be silly, but the truth is that I watch almost no TV and never did. I sometimes joke that I'm the only living American who never saw an episode of Seinfeld. I mean, that's literally the truth. Sometimes I will watch an important golf tournament, or I will watch an old movie. I'm addicted to old movies, but I don't watch much else. And the TV guide in our house will lay open all week to the Sunday page. So I prioritized my time differently than many people. I mean, it's amazing how much time you free up if you just don't watch TV. And the second thing, not to be falsely modest about it, is school was never very hard for me. I mean, if I set aside the time to show up for class, I didn't actually have to do much work. And so it was a matter of putting myself in a situation where I had to perform, and I would do so just by setting aside the time. And I always really liked learning new things. And so, whereas other people had other hobbies, I mean, for most of my adult life, my hobby was to learn new things, and that was the way I did it.
Would you like a job here? I think you just qualified.
Thank you. I think. Yes.
So it seems like aerospace in this country is consolidated to just a few very, very large companies. And what is the hope for a space startup? How would you go about that today?
Well, aerospace in this country is exactly like all of the other kinds of companies in this country, as well as all animals and plants. You know, the biosphere is obviously dominated by large land animals, but almost all of the biomass is in bacteria. Okay? In almost every field, there are a few really large dominant companies that are not very nimble and not very fleet-footed, and then there are many, many small companies vying to become big companies. You know, Lockheed Martin was once the Lockheed Brothers, and Glenn L. Martin, an individual operating, you know, on his mother's money. They were the Google of their time. There are quite a number of very intriguing and very exciting small companies in aerospace today. The question remains as to which of them is going to win. But if you look out across the aerospace landscape, yes, market share is dominated by, you know, Lockheed, Boeing, Northrop, Raytheon, Honeywell, a few other giants in the defense and aerospace industry. But there are many, many, many innovative small companies that I think, you know, 100 years from now, people will look back and say, oh, well, they were the obvious winner. You know, sure. I don't think it's as grim as you say. I really don't.
So I want to ask a question about innovation and risk. You mentioned that, you know, we don't have the luxury of sending up missions where people have a good chance of dying. If you listen to the space entrepreneurs alluded to in the previous question, you know, they lament the fact that NASA is as risk averse as it is. And if you think about our likely competitor, it's most likely China. And the Chinese have an inherently different view of sort of worth of life and seem likely to take more risks. So I guess the two aspects of this question are, you know, do you see it as a problem that we are so risk averse and protective of life? I mean, there are plenty of people clearly who would be willing to take the risks to their own lives if NASA or we as the U.S. government just let them. But who may not be able to make those risks in a private entrepreneurial venture. And you know, your point about the, you know, there's many of these companies out there, we'll see which ones survive, right? Well, that's how innovation happens, right? They all have different ideas, they all pursue it, we see which one happens. I didn't hear a lot of innovation in your talk. I mean, is NASA, it sounds more like you're just going to do the engineering to go redo the technology with sort of what we have, and there wasn't a lot of sort of,
let me address that.
Giant leaps.
You're right. I mean, there's not a lot of innovation in my talk because before we can innovate, I mean, the definition of innovation is doing what you haven't done before. We gave away, we're not starting from the base where we were at the end of Apollo, where something beyond Apollo would be innovation. We're starting well back from that. So by definition, nothing I can do to recreate basic capabilities, basic infrastructure, can be innovative. I can do certain things in a more innovative way. Software and electronics will be nothing like it was during the Apollo years. But it would be, it's like when you have, well, you may not be old enough, but you remember, I don't know, you may or may not remember the Loma Prieta earthquake out here in '89. So then for the next 15 years, there was a massive, 10 years, a massive rebuilding campaign to rebuild highway infrastructure. It wasn't innovative. They were rebuilding capability that was destroyed. And that's the situation we're in on the government side. Now, in parallel, I could rebuild capability and I could invest in new and innovative things, but in parallel implies being given more money than is currently being allocated to NASA, and that's not available. So there's that. Now, with regard to being risk averse, yes, I am appalled personally by this nation's general policy toward risk aversion. It is tragic when we lose a space shuttle, but it shouldn't be regarded as a national tragedy. It should not. It should be regarded as the loss, tragic loss, of a state-of-the-art experimental machine. But that's not how we look at things today, and that's a pendulum that swings back and forth.
Do you see it swinging towards, especially with all these space entrepreneurship?
I hope so.
More acceptance of risk?
I do, and I hope that I am correct in that view.
Thanks.
And that needs to be really kind of the last question, because we're at the end of the hour, I was told. I'm sorry, one more, and then that's it.
Okay, I just wanted to compare the average American taxpayer pays, I don't know exactly, but something like $35 a year for NASA.
It's about $55 a year for NASA. The average American taxpayer bill is about $8,000 a year for all of your taxes, and the NASA share of that is about $55 a year.
So that's what it costs for me to take my wife to Spider-Man 3 and pay for a...
Right, I know. And so, another way to look at it is 15 cents a day. Your tax bill for NASA is 15 cents a day.
So, and I would claim that you're sort of in the entertainment business. So the question is, how much does the average American, because that's what the average American gets from NASA, right? The average American is not an engineer that benefits from spin-offs and you're directly. Anyway, but my point is that what does the average American get from something like the work that we did on Mars with the exploration robots compared to 6 guys landing on the moon, on a sort of per year basis, right? It seems like there was a lot of excitement about the stuff that happened on Mars with robots. And I really wonder, has anyone done sort of a comparison of, on a per buck basis, what did Americans get back from these two things, and why are we putting so much effort into manned exploration instead of unmanned exploration?
Well, my own view is that that's a false choice. We want to do both. Okay, both are interesting, and they're interesting for different reasons. I'm afraid, you're not going to like my answer. It's one of those things like the old joke about walking into the store and asking what a Rolls Royce costs. If you have to ask, you can't afford it. I truly feel like if you have to ask why it is important for humans to push the frontier, then you won't understand the answer. Norm Augustine said, the former chairman of Lockheed Martin said 20 years ago, famously quoted, I love the quote, he said, no matter what, there is a difference between parachuting an instrumented package down on top of Mount Everest and climbing Mount Everest. There is a difference. And people are willing to risk their lives for that difference, and they're willing to pay money for that difference. Not all people, but the majority of people. I mean, if we weren't, we'd all still be in East Africa. I mean, I truly believe it is deeply rooted in our DNA. We strive as human beings, and indeed all animals, strive to occupy whatever niches are occupiable for humans with the state-of-the-art that we can bring to it. And I just do not think the majority of humans are satisfied with sending robots. But that's not an argument not to send robots. It's an argument not to send only robots. So that's my answer. Sorry, I'm sure it's unsatisfying, but that's the way it is. That needed to be the last one. I'm even with Google time, I'm now over the limit. So thank you.